The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls when Jake Morrison rode into town. His black stallion's hooves clicked against the worn wooden boards as he approached the small bakery that sat between the general store and the blacksmith shop. The sweet smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls drifted through the air, making his stomach growl after 3 days of trail rations. Jake had been riding hard from the Montana Territory, carrying important papers for the railroad company. His weathered hands gripped the reins as he studied the quaint little shop with its hand-painted sign that read, "Emma's Fresh Baked Goods." Through the window, he could see a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded dough on a flour-dusted counter. Emma Sullivan had been running the bakery for 2 years since her father passed away. At 25, she was known throughout Cedar Falls for her kind heart and the best apple pie this side of the Mississippi. She had turned down 3 marriage proposals from local men, claiming she was too busy keeping the business alive to think about romance. The truth was, none of them made her heart skip the way it did in the novels she secretly read by candlelight. The bell above the door chimed as Jake stepped inside, his spurs jangling softly against the wooden floor. Emma looked up from her work, wiping her flour-covered hands on her blue apron. Their eyes met for a moment, and she felt something flutter in her chest that she had never experienced before. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the unexpected nervousness she felt. "What can I get for you today?" Jake removed his worn leather hat, revealing thick dark hair that needed a trim. His green eyes surveyed the display case filled with fresh pastries, but he found himself more interested in studying the woman behind the counter. There was something different about her, something that made him want to linger in this small town longer than his business required. "Morning, ma'am," he replied, his deep voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "I was hoping to get some breakfast. Been riding since before dawn." Emma smiled, noticing the dust on his clothes and the tired lines around his eyes. "You look like you could use a good meal. I've got fresh biscuits, bacon, and coffee that's still hot. There's a table in the back if you'd like to sit." "That sounds perfect," Jake said, following her gesture toward a small wooden table near the window. As she bustled around preparing his meal, he watched her graceful movements and the way the morning light caught the copper highlights in her hair. "You're not from around here," Emma observed as she set a plate of steaming food in front of him. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. Cedar Falls was small enough that everyone knew everyone else. "No, ma'am. I'm just passing through on business," Jake replied, taking a grateful sip of the strong coffee. "This is mighty fine cooking. Best I've had in weeks." Emma felt a flutter of pride at the compliment. "Thank you. I learned from my father. He ran this place before me." She paused, studying his face. "What kind of business brings you to Cedar Falls?" "Railroad company sent me to deliver some papers to your mayor about a new line they're planning," Jake explained, cutting into a perfectly flaky biscuit. "Should be heading out this afternoon once I'm done." Something like disappointment flickered across Emma's face, though she tried to hide it. She had just met this stranger. But there was something about his quiet confidence and gentle manners that intrigued her. "That's too bad. I mean, that you can't stay longer to see our town properly." Jake noticed the slight change in her tone and felt a pull he hadn't experienced in years. He had been a drifter since the war ended, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. But something about this woman and her warm bakery made him reconsider his usual hurry to move on. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I could spare an extra day or two. Make sure my horse is rested for the journey ahead." Emma's face brightened, and she quickly turned away to hide her smile. "That would be nice. Cedar Falls doesn't get many interesting visitors." As Jake finished his breakfast, more customers began filtering into the bakery. Emma moved efficiently between them, greeting each by name and knowing exactly what they wanted without being told. Mrs. Henderson needed her usual dozen dinner rolls. Young Tommy wanted a sugar cookie for being good at school. Old Mr. Peterson required his daily slice of apple pie and black coffee. Jake watched this routine with growing fascination. In his travels, he had seen many towns and met many people. But there was something special about the way Emma connected with her community. She wasn't just selling baked goods. She was providing comfort, tradition, and a sense of home that he had been searching for without even realizing it. When the morning rush died down, Emma returned to Jake's table with the coffee pot. "More coffee?" "Thank you," Jake said, holding out his cup. "You know everyone in town pretty well." "Born and raised here," Emma explained, refilling his cup. "My mother died when I was 12, so I spent most of my time helping my father in the bakery. These people are like family to me. Must be nice, having roots like that." Jake mused, a touch of wistfulness in his voice. "I haven't had a place to call home in years." Emma sat down across from him, something she rarely did during business hours. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" Jake was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Lost everything in the war. Family, farm, everything that mattered. Been moving ever since, I guess. Working for whoever needs a good rider and isn't too particular about asking questions." "I'm sorry," Emma said softly. "That must have been terrible." "It was a long time ago," Jake replied, though his eyes suggested the wounds were still tender. "A man learns to make do with what he has." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Whitmore, the town's wealthiest resident and owner of the largest ranch in the county. He swept into the bakery with his usual air of self-importance, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as someone who considered himself above the common folk. "Emma, my dear," Charles said loudly, ignoring Jake's presence at the table. "I trust you've given thought to my proposal?" Emma's cheeks reddened with embarrassment and annoyance. "Mr. Whitmore, this isn't the time or place for such discussions." "Nonsense," Charles continued, puffing out his chest. "A woman in your position needs security. My offer of marriage would solve all your financial worries. This little bakery could become a hobby rather than a burden." Jake's jaw tightened at the condescending tone in the man's voice, but he remained seated, letting Emma handle her own business. However, his hand instinctively moved to rest near his gun belt, a habit formed from years of being ready for trouble. "Mr. Whitmore," Emma said firmly, "I've told you before that I'm not interested in your proposal. I'm perfectly capable of running my own business." Charles's face darkened with anger at being refused in front of a stranger. "You'll change your tune soon enough when the bank comes calling. Everyone knows you're behind on your payments." The color drained from Emma's face, and Jake saw her hands tremble slightly as she stood up. "I think you should leave now, Mr. Whitmore." "I'll leave when I'm ready," Charles snapped. "And you'll learn to show proper respect to your betters." That was enough for Jake. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and fixed Charles with a steady stare that had made grown men reconsider their actions on more than one occasion. "The lady asked you to leave," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge of danger. "I suggest you do as she asked." Charles looked Jake up and down, taking in the worn but well-maintained gun belt, and the confident way the cowboy held himself. "This doesn't concern you, stranger." "Anything that troubles a lady in my presence concerns me," Jake replied, stepping closer. "Now, you can walk out that door with your dignity intact, or I can help you find your way. Your choice." For a moment, the tension in the small bakery was thick enough to cut with a knife. Charles clearly wanted to assert his authority, but something in Jake's green eyes warned him that this was not a man to test. After a long moment, he straightened his expensive jacket and headed for the door. "This isn't over, Emma," he called back before stepping outside. "You'll come to your senses soon enough." Emma sank back into her chair, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. Jake sat down across from her, his demeanor immediately gentling. "You all right, miss?" he asked softly. Emma nodded, though tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you for that. Charles has been pressuring me for months, and it's been getting worse lately." "What did he mean about the bank?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Emma sighed, looking suddenly older than her 25 years. "Business has been slow lately. The railroad's been delayed, so fewer workers are coming through town. I've had to take out some loans to keep the bakery running, and now—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "How much do you owe?" Jake asked, gently. $200, Emma whispered. I have until the end of the month to pay it, or the bank will foreclose. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. $200 was more money than most people in Cedar Falls saw in a year, but it wasn't an insurmountable amount for someone with the right connections. What if I told you there might be a way to solve your problem? He said finally. Emma looked up at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. What do you mean? Jake leaned back in his chair, a plan beginning to form in his mind. I've got some money saved up from my work with the railroad. Not enough to just give away, but enough to make an investment in something worthwhile. I couldn't possibly accept charity, Emma said quickly, her pride flaring. Not charity, Jake corrected. Business. What if I bought all of today's baking? Everything you've got prepared, plus whatever you can make by closing time. For a fair price, of course. Emma stared at him in confusion. But why would you want to do that? You can't possibly eat all that food. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile Emma had seen from him since he walked through her door. Let's just say I know some hungry railroad workers who would appreciate a good meal. And maybe I've got my own reasons for wanting to help a lady in distress. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting warm golden light across the flour-dusted surfaces of the bakery. Emma looked at this mysterious cowboy who had appeared in her life like something out of one of her novels, offering solutions to problems she thought were impossible to solve. I don't even know your name, she said softly. Jake Morrison, he replied, touching the brim of his hat. And you're Emma Sullivan, if the sign outside is anything to go by. Yes, she said, feeling that flutter in her chest again. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your offer, but I need to understand what you're really proposing. Jake leaned forward, his green eyes serious but kind. I'm proposing to buy every item you can bake between now and closing time. Bread, pies, cookies, whatever you've got. I'll pay you enough to cover your debt to the bank, and maybe a little extra to help you get back on your feet. And in return? Emma asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the golden afternoon light. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but she heard every word clearly. In return, Miss Sullivan, I'd like the chance to prove that not all men are like Charles Whitmore, and maybe, if you're willing, the opportunity to show you what it means to be courted by someone who sees you as more than just a business arrangement. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she met his gaze. There was something in his eyes that promised adventure, passion, and the kind of romance she had only read about in books. But there was also something else, something that made her pulse race with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Morrison? She asked, though she suspected she already knew. Jake stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact. He moved around the table until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage that seemed to cling to his clothes. What I'm saying, Miss Emma Sullivan, he said, his voice low and intense, is that your heart might just be the last thing I claim tonight. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Jake's words hung in the air between them. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the bakery windows seemed to wrap around them both, creating an intimate cocoon that shut out the rest of the world. She had never met a man who spoke so directly, yet with such gentleness in his voice. Mr. Morrison, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Jake, he said simply, and before you say anything else, let me show you I'm a man of my word. He walked to the display case and began pointing to every item behind the glass. I'll take all of those apple pies, every loaf of bread you've got, all the cookies, and whatever else you can bake before closing time. He pulled a well-worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket. How much would that cost me? Emma's mind raced as she tried to calculate the total. That would be nearly $300 worth of baked goods, she stammered. Mr. Morrison, Jake, I can't let you do this. It's too much. It's not nearly enough, Jake replied, counting out crisp bills onto the counter. A woman like you shouldn't have to worry about losing her livelihood because some banker decided to call in his debts early. How did you know the bank called them in early? Emma asked, surprised by his insight. Jake's expression darkened. Because I've seen it before. Men like Whitmore have arrangements with banks. They target properties they want, pressure the bank to demand early payment, then swoop in to buy at a fraction of the value when the owner can't pay. Emma sank into the chair behind the counter, the full scope of her situation becoming clear. So Charles orchestrated this whole thing? Most likely, Jake confirmed. He wants your property for some reason, maybe to expand his holdings in town, maybe just to have power over you. Either way, we're going to make sure he doesn't get what he wants. The determination in his voice made Emma's heart race. She had spent months feeling helpless and alone, watching her father's legacy slip away despite her best efforts. Now this mysterious cowboy had appeared like an answer to her prayers, offering not just financial help but protection from the forces working against her. I need to ask, she said carefully. Why are you really doing this? You don't know me. And this is more money than most people see in a lifetime. Jake was quiet for a moment, leaning against the counter as he considered his answer. You want the honest truth? Yes. I've been drifting for 8 years now, ever since the war ended. Working for the railroad, carrying messages, sometimes hiring my gun out to folks who needed protection. I've seen a lot of towns, met a lot of people, but I never found a reason to stay anywhere. He paused, meeting her eyes, until I walked through that door this morning. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. You can't possibly know me well enough to make that kind of decision. Maybe not, Jake admitted. But I know enough. I know you're kind to your customers, even the difficult ones. I know you stand up to men like Whitmore, even when you're scared. I know you work harder than anyone should have to just to honor your father's memory. He stepped closer, and I know that when you smiled at me this morning, I felt something I haven't felt since before the war. The honesty in his voice took Emma's breath away. She had dreamed of romance, but the reality was more intense than anything she had imagined. This wasn't the gentle courtship she had read about in books. This was raw and immediate and slightly dangerous. What happens after tonight? She asked. Do you ride out of town with your business completed, leaving me with a bakery full of money and a heart full of confusion? Jake's smile was slow and warm. That depends entirely on you, Miss Sullivan. I've got no pressing business anywhere else. The railroad can wait for their next job. Question is, are you brave enough to find out what happens when a woman like you takes a chance on a man like me? Before Emma could answer, the bell above the door chimed again. This time, it was Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, looking flustered and worried. Emma, thank goodness you're still open, Sarah said breathlessly. There's trouble brewing at the saloon. Charles Whitmore has been drinking and talking loud about some cowboy who embarrassed him. Sheriff Porter is out of town, and folks are getting nervous. Jake's expression immediately became alert and focused. What exactly is he saying? Sarah noticed Jake for the first time and glanced between him and Emma. Are you the cowboy he's talking about? Depends on what he's saying, Jake replied calmly. He's claiming you threatened him and that he won't stand for some drifter coming into town and interfering with his business, Sarah explained. He's got 3 of his ranch hands with him, and they're all armed. Emma felt fear clench in her stomach. Jake, maybe you should leave town now, before this gets worse. I'm not running from Charles Whitmore, Jake said firmly. Men like him count on decent folks backing down when they make threats. But if something happens to you, Emma began, surprised by how much the thought frightened her. Jake moved to her side and gently took her hand. Nothing's going to happen to me, and nothing's going to happen to you. But I need to go deal with this before it gets out of hand. He squeezed her hand softly. Keep baking. I'll be back before closing time to collect everything I paid for. Jake, wait, Emma called as he headed for the door. What if Charles is right? What if you are just a drifter who'll move on when things get complicated? Jake stopped with his hand on the door handle and turned back to face her. The look in his eyes was so intense it made her knees weak. Miss Sullivan, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I've spent 8 years running from complications, but some things are worth standing and fighting for. You're one of them. After Jake left, Emma found herself unable to concentrate on her baking. Her hands shook as she mixed dough, and she burned the first batch of cookies she put in the oven. Sarah stayed to help, but mostly to provide moral support and keep Emma from wearing a hole in the floor with her pacing. Tell me about him, Sarah said, as she helped Emma roll out pie crusts. Where did he come from? I don't know much, Emma admitted. He's working for the railroad, traveling through on business. But there's something about him, Sarah. Something that makes me feel like I've been waiting my whole life for him to walk through that door. That's very romantic, Sarah said with a smile, but also very dangerous. You just met him this morning. I know how it sounds, Emma replied. But when he looks at me, I feel like he sees all of me. Not just the baker or the business owner, or the woman Charles wants to control. He sees me. Through the window, they could hear raised voices from the direction of the saloon. Emma's heart hammered every time the volume increased, fearing it meant violence had broken out. She had lived in Cedar Falls her entire life, and while there had been occasional disputes, nothing like this had ever happened. Maybe we should close early, Sarah suggested, noticing Emma's distress. No, Emma said firmly. Jake said to keep baking. And that's what I'm going to do. He paid me to have goods ready by closing time. And I intend to honor that agreement. As the afternoon wore on, Emma threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She baked bread, mixed cookie dough, and prepared 3 more apple pies. With each item that came out of the oven perfectly golden and fragrant, she felt a little of her confidence return. The sun was beginning to set when the saloon doors burst open and Charles Whitmore stormed out, followed by 3 rough-looking men who worked on his ranch. Even from a distance, Emma could see that Charles was drunk and angry. Her heart sank as she realized the confrontation she had been dreading was about to happen. But then Jake emerged from the saloon, walking calmly and deliberately. He wasn't rushing or appearing worried, just moving with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Behind him came several other townspeople, including the mayor and Dr. Harrison. What's happening? Sarah asked, pressing her face to the window. Emma watched as Charles turned to face Jake in the middle of the dusty street. The 3 ranch hands spread out slightly, positioning themselves for trouble, but Jake seemed completely unperturbed by the odds against him. Charles Whitmore, Jake's voice carried clearly in the evening air. You've got something to say to me. Say it direct. Stop hiding behind whiskey and hired hands. You humiliated me in front of the whole town. Charles slurred, swaying slightly on his feet. Made me look like a fool in front of my woman. Miss Sullivan isn't your woman, Jake replied evenly. She's made it clear she's not interested in your attentions. A gentleman would respect that. Charles's face turned red with rage. She'll come around when she realizes what her options are. Especially after you're gone. 2. I'm not going anywhere, Jake said, and something in his tone made Emma's heart leap. I've found reasons to stay. What happened next took place so quickly that Emma almost missed it. Charles reached for his gun, but before he could clear leather, Jake had drawn his own weapon with lightning speed. The 3 ranch hands started to move, but found themselves facing the business ends of guns held by Mayor Thompson, Dr. Harrison, and 2 other townsmen. Now, Charles, Mayor Thompson said firmly, you're drunk, and you're making a fool of yourself. Why don't you sleep this off and we'll forget the whole thing? Charles looked around wildly, realizing he was outnumbered and outgunned. His ranch hands, seeing the situation clearly, slowly raised their hands to show they weren't looking for trouble. This isn't over, Charles snarled at Jake. I own half this town, and I'll have the other half soon enough. Maybe, Jake replied, holstering his gun with the same casual ease he had drawn it. But you won't get it by threatening women or starting gunfights in the street. As Charles and his men retreated toward their horses, Jake turned and looked directly at the bakery window. Even across the distance, Emma could see him smile before he started walking back toward her shop. Oh my, Sarah breathed. Emma, I think you might be in more trouble than you realize. What do you mean? Emma asked, though her pulse was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. I mean, that man just faced down 4 armed men without breaking a sweat, and he did it for you, Sarah explained. That's not the behavior of someone who's planning to drift out of town tomorrow. Emma's hands fluttered to her hair, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. Do I look presentable? I've been baking all day, and I must be covered in flour. Sarah laughed and reached over to adjust Emma's apron. "You look like a woman who's been working hard to fulfill a promise." That's exactly what he wants to see. The bell chimed as Jake pushed through the door, and Emma felt her breath catch all over again. There was something different about him now. A sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The confrontation with Charles seemed to have settled something in his mind. "Everything all right?" Emma asked, though she could see from his expression that it was. "Everything's fine," Jake replied. "Charles won't be bothering you anymore, at least not directly, and I think the rest of the town understands where things stand now." "Where do things stand?" Emma asked softly. Jake looked around the bakery, taking in the results of her afternoon's work. The counter was covered with fresh loaves of bread, golden pies, and perfectly shaped cookies. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of her labor. "Things stand exactly where I hoped they would," he said, moving closer to her. "You kept your word about the baking, even when you were worried about what was happening outside. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And what about your character, Mr. Morrison? What should I know about a man who buys a bakery's worth of goods and faces down armed men for a woman he just met?" Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is what I was really delivering to Mayor Thompson. Not railroad papers, but a letter of recommendation from the territorial governor. I've been offered a position as town sheriff here in Cedar Falls." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "You mean you weren't just passing through?" "I was supposed to be," Jake admitted. "But when I walked into this bakery this morning and saw you, I knew I'd found what I'd been looking for." He paused, studying her face. "The question is, are you ready to find out what happens when you take a chance on forever?" The weight of his words settled over Emma like a warm blanket. This wasn't just about one night, or even 1 week. This was about building something lasting, something real. "Forever is a big word, Jake Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it is," he agreed, stepping close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "But some things are worth the risk." As the last light of day faded outside the windows, Emma looked around her father's bakery and realized it was about to become something entirely new. Not just a business, but the beginning of a love story that would be talked about in Cedar Falls for generations to come. The clock on the bakery wall chimed 8 times, marking the official end of Emma's business day. She had never kept the shop open this late, but somehow it felt right to extend the hours on this particular evening. Jake had been helping her package all the baked goods he had purchased, working with surprising skill for a man who clearly spent more time with horses than with bread. "You're quite handy in a kitchen," Emma observed, watching him wrap loaves of bread in brown paper with practiced efficiency. "A man learns to be useful with his hands when he's been living on his own for as long as I have," Jake replied. "Though I admit, this is a lot more pleasant than cooking over a campfire." Emma smiled as she carefully placed the last apple pie in a wooden crate. "What are you really going to do with all this food? There can't be enough railroad workers in the territory to eat all of this." Jake paused in his wrapping and looked at her with that intensity that made her heart skip. "Well, I figured I'd share some with the folks at the boarding house. Maybe take some to the families who could use a good meal. The rest," he shrugged. "I suppose I'll have to find creative ways to use it." "That's very generous of you," Emma said softly. "Most men wouldn't spend this much money just to help a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore, Emma," Jake replied, his voice low and warm. "Not after today." As they finished packing the last of the baked goods, Emma felt a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty swirling in her chest. Jake had solved her immediate financial problems and protected her from Charles's threats, but she still didn't know what came next. The intensity of their connection frightened her as much as it thrilled her. "Jake," she began hesitantly, "about what you said earlier, about claiming my heart." He set down the package he was holding and turned to face her fully. "Are you worried I was speaking out of turn?" "I'm worried about a lot of things," Emma admitted. "This morning I woke up thinking I might lose everything I had left of my father. Tonight, I'm standing here with a man who's changed my entire life in the space of 12 hours. It feels like a dream." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his green eyes. Dreams can come true, Emma. But only if you're brave enough to believe in them. What if I'm not brave enough? She whispered. What if I'm just a small-town baker who doesn't know how to handle something this big? Jake reached out and gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. Then I'll teach you. And you can teach me how to build something lasting instead of always moving on when things get complicated. The tenderness in his touch undid the last of Emma's resistance. She had spent her entire life being careful, being practical, being the responsible daughter who kept her father's business alive. For once, she wanted to follow her heart instead of her head. What exactly are you asking me, Jake Morrison? She said, though she was almost certain she knew. I'm asking if you'll take a chance on us, he replied. I'm asking if you'll let me court you properly, the way a woman like you deserves to be courted. I'm asking if you'll consider the possibility that sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them. Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. And if I say yes? What then? Then I accept that sheriff position, and we see where this leads us, Jake said simply. I buy a house, maybe even help you expand the bakery if that's what you want. We take things one day at a time and build something real together. The picture he painted was so appealing that Emma could hardly breathe. A life with someone who understood her, who respected her independence but also wanted to share in her dreams. It was everything she had secretly hoped for but never believed she would find. There's something I need to tell you first, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That is, I don't have experience with men like you. Jake's smile was gentle and understanding. Emma, I've been with women who knew all the right words and none of the right feelings. I'd rather have someone honest and real than someone who's just playing a part. Before Emma could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Through the glass, they could see Mayor Thompson standing on the step, hat in hand. Come in, Mayor, Emma called, quickly stepping back from Jake and smoothing her apron. Sorry to interrupt, Mayor Thompson said as he entered. But I wanted to speak with both of you about what happened today. He looked directly at Jake. That was well handled out there. Charles needed to be reminded that he doesn't run this town, just doing what needed to be done, Jake replied modestly. Which is exactly why I hope you'll reconsider taking the sheriff position. The mayor continued. We've been without proper law enforcement for 3 months now, and today proved we need someone who can handle troublemakers like Whitmore. Jake glanced at Emma before answering. I'm definitely interested in the position, Mayor. In fact, I think Cedar Falls might be exactly the kind of place I've been looking for. Mayor Thompson's face broke into a wide smile. Excellent. We can discuss the details tomorrow, but I can tell you the job comes with a house and a steady salary, enough for a man to put down roots if he's so inclined. After the mayor left, Emma and Jake found themselves alone again in the warm glow of the bakery's oil lamps. The practical matters had been settled, but the emotional weight of their situation still hung between them. So it's official then, Emma said. You're staying in Cedar Falls. If you want me to, Jake replied. The job is just a job, Emma. You're the real reason I want to stay. The honesty in his voice took her breath away. Jake, I think I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because love means trusting someone with everything, Emma explained. My heart, my future, my father's legacy. What if I'm wrong about you? What if you change your mind? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Do you know what I learned during the war? He finally asked. That life is uncertain and precious, and shorter than any of us want to believe. I spent 8 years after that war, being afraid to care about anything because I was terrified of losing it again. He moved closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. But meeting you made me realize that being afraid to live is worse than being afraid to lose. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she hadn't even realized was locked. You're really going to stay? Even when things get difficult? Even when Charles causes more trouble? Even when you remember how much easier it was when you could just ride away? I'm going to stay, Jake confirmed, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Because some things are worth fighting for, worth building a life around. You're one of those things, Emma Sullivan. The tears that had been threatening all evening finally spilled over, but Emma was smiling through them. In that case, yes. Yes? Jake asked, though hope was already lighting up his features. Yes. I'll let you court me properly. Yes. I want to see where this leads us. Yes. I think I'm brave enough to believe in dreams after all. Jake's response was immediate and overwhelming. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak and her heart race. It was nothing like the chaste kisses she had imagined from reading romantic novels. This was real and intense, and promised all sorts of wonderful complications in her formerly simple life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. I have a confession to make, he said softly. What's that? When I walked into this bakery this morning, I was planning to eat breakfast and deliver my message and be gone by noon. But then I saw you, and something inside me just settled, like I'd been wandering lost for years, and finally found my way home. Emma's heart melted at his words. That's quite a confession, Sheriff Morrison. I like the sound of that, Jake said with a grin. And I like the way you say it even more. As they finished cleaning up the bakery, working side by side in comfortable silence, Emma marveled at how different her life looked than it had just hours before. The debt that had been crushing her was paid. The man who had been threatening her was neutralized. And she was falling in love with someone who seemed too good to be true. Jake, she said as they prepared to lock up for the night. What you said earlier about my heart being the last thing you'd claim tonight. What about it? Emma turned to face him in the doorway, the evening breeze stirring the loose tendrils of hair around her face. You were wrong about one thing. What's that? It wasn't the last thing you claimed, she said softly. It was the first. Everything else just followed. Jake's smile was slow and warm and full of promise. In that case, Miss Sullivan, I'd say this has been a very successful day. The best day, Emma agreed, then surprised herself by standing on her tiptoes and kissing him again, right there on the main street of Cedar Falls for anyone to see. When they parted, Jake chuckled softly. What was that for? For being exactly what I never knew I was waiting for, Emma replied. For keeping your word about everything you promised. For making me believe in something I thought only existed in books. And what's that? True love, Emma said simply. The kind that changes everything in the best possible way. As they walked together toward Emma's small house behind the bakery, Jake carrying the lantern and Emma's hand safely tucked in his arm, neither of them could have imagined that 50 years later, their grandchildren would still be hearing the story of the cowboy who rode into Cedar Falls on a dusty Tuesday morning and claimed the baker's heart before sunset. The bakery would flourish under their combined care, becoming known throughout the territory for Emma's exceptional baking and Jake's fair enforcement of the law. Charles Whitmore would eventually leave town after a series of failed business ventures, never again finding the influence he had once wielded through fear and intimidation. But all of that was still in the future. Tonight, there was only a man and woman walking together under a canopy of stars, talking softly about dreams they had never dared to voice before, and plans that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Emma, Jake said as they reached her front door, I want you to know that everything I told you today was true. I may have only known you for one day, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I know, Emma replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. And Jake? Thank you for being brave enough to claim my heart. I've been waiting my whole life for someone who would. Jake kissed her hand gently before stepping back. Sweet dreams, Miss Sullivan. I'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning for breakfast. It's a date, Sheriff Morrison, Emma said with a smile that could have lit up the entire town. As Jake walked away toward the boarding house where he would spend his last night as a drifter, Emma stood in her doorway and watched until his figure disappeared into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new adventures. But tonight she was content to stand under the stars and marvel at how quickly and completely her world had changed. The cowboy had indeed claimed her heart, just as he had promised. But in return, she had given him something he had been searching for without even knowing it. A reason to stay. a place to belong, and a love worth building a lifetime around. In Cedar Falls, they would remember this day as the beginning of a love story that proved sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them and are brave enough to believe in them when they do.